Hi there, boys and girls. Today for story time, we're going to read Mr. Messy by Roger Hargreaves. Mr. Messy was the messiest person you've ever met in your whole life. He looked messy because he was messy in everything he did. You could always tell where Mr. Messy had been because he left a trail of messy fingerprints wherever he had been. Oh yes, Mr. Messy was messy by name and messy by nature. He even left fingerprints in this book. It's so messy. Mr. Messy lived in a particularly messy-looking house. The paint was peeling, the windows were broken, the tiles were missing from the roof, flower beds were overgrown with weeds, and the garden gate was off of its hinges. And had Mr. Messy cut the grass in his garden lately? No, he had not. One morning, Mr. Messy woke up in his messy bed. He yawned, scratched, and got up and cleaned his teeth, leaving the top off the toothpaste. Then he had his breakfast, spilling cornflakes all over the floor. And then he set out for a walk, tripping over the broom that he had left lying in the garden 2 weeks ago. You don't leave the toothpaste lid off, do you? You don't make a mess with cornflakes on the floor, with your cereal on the floor, do you? You don't leave the broom out, do you? No, we put it back. There were some woods behind Mr. Messy's house. Behind Mr. Messy's messy house, with the messy garden. And that's where he went for his walk. It was a particularly large woods with lots and lots of trees, and it took Mr. Messy a long time to walk through it. But he didn't really mind because he felt like walking that morning. So he walked and walked right through the woods until he came to the other side. Do you know what he found on the other side of the woods? Mr. Messy found the neatest, prettiest, nicest looking little cottage that he had ever seen. Remember, a cottage is a small house. It had a lovely little garden with a little stream running right behind it. Does that house look better? Do you like that one better, or do you like this house better? This one? Or that one? Yeah, this house looks nice. There was a man in the garden, trimming the hedges. He looked up as Mr. Messy approached. "Good morning, I'm Mr. Messy," said Mr. Messy. "I can see that," replied the man, looking up and down. "I'm Mr. Tidy." "And I'm Mr. Neat," said another man, appearing out of the house. "Tidy and neat," said Mr. Tidy. "Neat and tidy," said Mr. Neat. "We're in business together," explained Mr. Tidy, "and the people who own this house have asked us to do some work for them." "What sort of work?" asked Mr. Messy. "Oh, we make things neat, nice and neat," said Mr. Neat. "We tidy them up," added Mr. Tidy. "Perhaps we could come along and do some work for you," said Mr. Neat, looking at Mr. Messy, who was looking even messier than usual that particular morning. "But I don't want things neat and tidy," said Mr. Messy. "I like them messy," looking downright miserable at the thought. It's Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy. "Nonsense," said Mr. Tidy. "Fiddlesticks," said Mr. Neat. But I like them messy," said Mr. Messy. "Come along," said Mr. Neat. "Off we go," said Mr. Tidy. But nothing," said Mr. Neat, and he bundled him up into their van, which was parked behind the house, and off they went to Mr. Messy's house at the other side of the woods. It says Neat and Tidy. See their little work van? "Good heavens," said Mr. Neat, when he saw where Mr. Messy lived. "Good gracious me," added Mr. Tidy. "This is the messiest house I have ever seen in all my born days," they both said together at the same time. "We'd better do something about it," said Mr. Neat, and before Mr. Messy could open his mouth, the two of them were rushing here and there, everywhere, all about Mr. Messy's house. Mr. Neat hoed and mowed, pruned and snipped, and clipped and cleared and dug, and made the garden look neater than it had ever looked before. Mr. Tidy cleaned and primed and rubbed and painted and mended, and he made the outside of Mr. Messy's house look tidier than it had ever looked before. Then both of them went inside the house. Good heavens, said Mr. Neat for the second time that morning. Good gracious, said Mr. Tidy for the second time that morning. Then they both set about cleaning the house, inside the house, from top to bottom. They brushed and swept and polished and scrubbed and made the inside of the house look neater and tidier than it had ever looked before. There we are, said Mr. Tidy. All finished, said Mr. Neat. Tidy and neat, said Mr. Tidy. Neat and tidy, said Mr. Neat. Mr. Messy just didn't know what to say. They had cleaned up his house, his yard. That was nice. Then they both looked at Mr. Messy. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Mr. Neat said to Mr. Tidy. Precisely, replied Mr. Tidy. What we're both thinking, they said together, is that you look much too messy to live in a neat and tidy house like this. But, said Mr. Messy. But whatever Mr. Messy but whatever Mr. Messy said was no use, and Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy whisked him off to the bathroom, upstairs. It had been the messiest room in the whole house, but now, of course, it was neat as a new pin. Then Mr. Neat got a hold of one of Mr. Messy's arms, and Mr. Tidy got a hold of the other arm, and they picked him up and put him straight into the bath. Mr. Messy wasn't used to having a bath. Have you taken your bath tonight? Probably better. You don't want to be Mr. Messy. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy washed and brushed and cleaned and scrubbed and combed Mr. Messy until he didn't look like Mr. Messy at all. In fact, he looked the opposite of messy, and he looked at himself in the mirror. You know what I'm going to have to do now, he said in a rather fierce voice. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy looked worried. He doesn't look like Mr. Messy now, does he? He's all cleaned up. Just a moment. Sorry, this. What are you going to have to do? They asked Mr. Messy. I'm going to have to change my name, said Mr. Messy. And then he chuckled. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy chuckled. And then Mr. Messy laughed. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy laughed, and then they all laughed together and became the best of friends. And that's really the end of the story, except to say that if you're a messy sort of person, you might have a visit from two people. Mr. Neat and Mr. Tidy. You know who they are, don't you? The end. Mr. Messy. Don't be Mr. Messy. Make sure you clean up your room tonight and go take a bath. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.